Um, so this, by way of review, these are the different topics that we're going to create these mini clips about. And these are the topics that have been highlighted in each of these community meetings. And so we've already done state-dependent functioning, emotional contagion, patterns of stress activation, the sequence of engagement, and we're now starting with understanding regulation. So these are the topics that are coming up, and for those of you who are sort of tracking with this, the fourth video clip will be ready to post probably later today or tomorrow morning, and I'll put that up and I'll share that with folks. Just a note, we've been closed captioning these for those of you who need that, and we're going to experiment with closed captioning this in Spanish for the folks who are predominantly Spanish speaking, and we should have some feedback about that later this week to let people know how easy it has been to do that. All right, so today we're talking about regulation. And of course, this is something that we've been talking about, everybody out there in the world sort of giving any kind of help or talking about this at all ends up touching on the topics related to feeling anxious or stressed, and then managing that. And at the, we don't always use that kind of language. We tend to use the language of regulation or dysregulation. And so regulation is something that is really at the heart of our specific model and our approach. And part of what we do when we try to help people understand all these things is talk a little bit about how the brain has systems that are involved in helping you stay regulated. And when we talk about regulation that way, really what we're meaning is that we've got, these very complex networks in your body are involved in this nonstop process of getting information from the outside world, sorting it and processing it, and then sending signals to the organs and the systems in the brain that help you adapt to whatever the challenge is. And so from a sort of this physiological perspective, hunger, thirst, chaos in your environment, those are all stressors. And that information gets into the lower parts of your brain, which I'll show in a minute. And then these core regulatory networks here basically send signals out into the body through a variety of routes or up into different key parts of the brain, and basically say, under this circumstance with lack of oxygen, I need to, number one, tell myself to stop walking up the steps and sit for a minute and catch my breath. And then I also need to send a signal to my diaphragm to expand a little bit more so that I can take deeper breaths, and then I can take more frequent breaths. And so there's this orchestrated, integrated response to the stressor of walking up steps, for example. And you've got tons of systems in your body that are continually monitoring the external world, right, and your internal world to help you figure out what's going on. And then you've got these internal systems that reach all parts of the brain and all parts of the body that help you adapt to these challenges. Now, just keep that in your head, and I'm going to go to a new paragraph. Envision a new chapter. So one of the things that I want to talk about before I get into a little bit of a deeper dive about regulation is the the way your brain kind of makes sense out of the world. Now, again, just back up for a moment and think about the developing brain in utero. You've got, we start out as one single cell, and that divides, and then those divide, and then those divide, and they start to move and specialize. And some cells are going to become muscles, and some cells are going to become bones, and some cells are going to become neurons, and then the brain starts to form. And within the brain, there are all kinds of other really specialized things that are happening. And little by little, your brain develops the capacity to sense information from the outside world and from your inside world. And so your brain basically begins to try to make sense out of the world. And the way it does that is by taking patterns of activity of neural networks that co-occur. And when they co-occur with sufficient frequency, we tie them together, we connect them. And so if you hear a certain sound, at the same time you always see a certain thing, your brain connects the sound with the image. And even though those are very different neural networks, your brain makes sense out of the world by connecting the sound of, after you're born, for example, the sound of a bark with the visual image of a four-legged furry creature. And your brain does that with all kinds of things. Now, the reason I'm talking about that is that one of the most important things that happens to all of us when we are in utero, when we're where little fetal brain is organizing and our fetal body's growing, one of the most important associations that we ever make takes place when all of the somatosensory cues, the input from the outside of the world, and input from the inside of the little fetal body meet in lower parts of the brain where these core regulatory networks are organizing. And so one of the things that happens is that the incoming input from your little fetal body is sending signals back that say, hey, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I'm not cold. I'm not hungry because I'm getting nonstop calories from mom. I'm not thirsty because I'm in liquid. And I'm not cold because I'm at this constant temperature of 98.7. And this is continually coming up in, and at the same time that's continually coming in, what else is continually coming into that part of the brain? Well, a rhythmic vibration, rhythmic touch, rhythmic sound. So through at least 3 different sensory routes, you're getting a rhythm, and pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity. And what happens is your brain makes a very powerful association between rhythm and feeling safe and feeling regulated and in all of these key physiological domains. So literally in utero and after you're born, you get this signal, you get this internal association that somato, both sort of movement and sensory input that's rhythmic, that's 40, 60, 80 beats per minute, is going to make you feel safe, more regulated. It's regulating. It sends a signal to your brain that you are going to be okay. And then after you're born, if you have a caregiver, and almost all of us do have primary caregivers who, when we're hungry, thirsty, cold, they come and meet our fundamental needs. So there's a whole set of relationally related cues. The smell, the sight, the sound, the visual image of mom's smile, of her smell. And when that happens, you're getting distressed because you're hungry, and your caregiver comes and responds, you get back to this regulated state. And while the caregiver is with you, what the caregiver learns and knows is that if I give my infant pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity, if I rock my baby, if I talk to my baby in baby talk, if I stroke the back of my baby's head in a certain way, those pattern, repetitive experiences make the child feel calmer. And so the caregiver reinforces this core rhythmic association with safety and begins to build into the brain of the individual a relational set of cues that make you feel safe. And so really what happens with the present, attentive, attuned, and responsive caregiver is that your brain weaves together the most important set of associations that you will ever make. And these are the associations that you create between rhythm and regulation, and the associations you create between relational presence and reward and pleasure, and relational presence and stress regulation. And so the 3 R's that are woven together are relationship, reward, and regulation. And later on, as we'll talk about, just the presence of somebody who you feel safe with, literally seeing their face makes your stress response system go down. Seeing their face, hearing their voice makes you feel pleasure. And it's because you've made an association between the neurobiological networks of pleasure and the and their relational presence. And that happens because when you're hungry, thirsty, and cold, you're distressed. But this caregiver comes and they feed you and they warm you. And so at the same time that this caregiver is present, you're decreasing your physiological distress, which I think most of you realize is actually going to activate parts of the brain involved in pleasure. And so this is attachment, right? This is what happens with bonding behavior and the development of attachment quality, attachment characteristics. That an attentive, attuned, responsive caregiver leads to a healthy set of associations that have their origins in the experiences that infant is having with the set of primary caregivers. And that turns out to be very, very important. And as you get older, all of these smells, sounds, rhythms of the intrauterine world and the attributes of the primary caregiving experiences are able to elicit and activate your primary regulatory network. In other words, calm you down. That's a crucial aspect of understanding regulation. Now, take a break for 1 second, clear your brain, and let's talk about the concept of plasticity. So plasticity, neuroplasticity is very much related to regulation, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But the first thing I want you to appreciate is that neuroplasticity is basically a term that we use that refers to the malleability or the changeability and responsivity of neural networks. They respond, their activity changes and in ways that are both acute, short-term, and long-term when we activate them in certain ways. And one of the key aspects of neuroplasticity is specificity, which basically means that you can't change the activity or the attributes of a neural network unless you activate that neural network. So now what that basically means is you can't regulate somebody unless you actually get to this part of the brain, because that's the set of that's where the core regulatory networks originate. So when you adhere to the principles of specificity, what that means is if you want to regulate somebody, you've got to somehow get to these neural networks. Now, there's a couple of ways to get there. One way is from the top down. You can sort of get to these core regulatory networks by actually having a thought and saying, you know what, I'm going to sort of intellectually go through my risk for getting COVID and use that intellectual part of your brain to basically indirectly, because you have to go through intermediary networks to ultimately get to the core regulatory network. You can use your cortex to calm yourself down, right? That's what we call top-down. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is a top-down approach that helps you use your cortex and your thinking to basically regulate your affect and your regulation. And it can work. However, if you are very, very, very dysregulated, let me change this for a second. If you're very dysregulated and this part of the brain is very, 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 very active, it's extremely difficult to use top-down mechanisms to regulate yourself. So for example, there's a lot of people that we know who are in the midst of this crisis who, if you tried to reason with them about why they shouldn't be so dysregulated because they have a place to live and they have a job and they have, they're not in a risk category for getting this, but they're still extremely anxious and overwhelmed, you will have a hard time getting them, when they're in an activated state, to actually change very much with a reasoning strategy, with a top-down strategy. Fortunately, we have the other way that we can actually directly reach those systems in the brain, and that's the bottom up. And this is where those of you who are familiar with our work, you know that we talk a lot about pattern, repetitive, somatosensory activity as being fundamentally regulating. And that's because we think it's more effective, because it's deeply ingrained, and it's easy to directly get to the regulatory networks in the brain by walking, by music, by swimming, running, riding a bike, petting a dog, doing all kinds of pattern, repetitive, rhythmic things. And those things are going to help you self-regulate. And so if you start to look at how you yourself are able to calm down when you feel dysregulated, there's really only three choices. The first one is this top-down one, which we tend to overvalue in our modern Western world. We're a very verbal society. We think we overvalue words. But the reality is, in regular human communication, words are only about 10% of the total substance of what gets communicated. Tone of voice, nonverbal cues convey more information than the words. And so words are powerful and amazing, and our cortex is great. But in order to use top-down mechanisms, you need to have a pretty organized and pretty active cortex. And as one of the things that we talked about earlier in an earlier session is that what we know about state-dependent functioning is that if you're a typically regulated person and you start to get dysregulated, your cortex basically drops to about 10% of its basic efficiency. So you're asking somebody to use the very organ that is partially compromised by stress to control your own distress, and it doesn't work very well. This is why bottom-up approaches are, in my opinion, really sort of the first option and the most effective option when you're trying to help regulate children, individuals who have a sensitized stress response, and even probably it's the best option to regulate yourself. And those of you that are used to using a variety of sort of mindfulness practices, deep breathing things, people that use rhythm in different ways, all of these are bottom-up regulatory mechanisms that are very, very effective. And you'll see, if you watch kids, you'll see that they use this as a predominant preference. And they'll rock when they're uncomfortable. They'll get up and want to move. That's a reflection of them trying to self-regulate, and it's not a bad thing. The third thing, and again, this is something that we tend not to appreciate that much, and I think mental health has done a disservice to the term dissociation. A lot of people view this as pathological. Dissociation is a normal mental mechanism that we all use. In fact, it is the #1 predominant form of self-regulation that we all use. We all use it every day. Now, a classic example is how you tune out in the middle of a meeting, how you disengage partially even during this presentation and think about what I'm saying and how it fits your internal working model of the world. That's dissociative, and it's a very positive thing. And maybe later on, if we end up having 35 of these presentations, I'll do a deep dive into dissociation. But I think that dissociation is really a powerful thing. We teach people how to intentionally dissociate by teaching them things like self-hypnosis or guided imagery. People who do prayer, who do meditation, they're they're doing proactive, intentional dissociation, and it's regulatory. And it's a very powerful mechanism, and you can learn to use it as opposed to having it just sort of randomly pop, control your functioning. So three routes to self-regulation. But the reality is human beings are very rarely only by themselves. And the most powerful form of regulation and the most powerful forms of regulation are combinations of these when you're with other people. So people feel safest when they're with their clan, with their people, when they feel that they're with folks they belong with. And so in the presence of people that you love and respect, you feel safer. And that's because of that powerful relational regulation thing that I touched on a little bit right here. That in the beginning of your life, your brain basically has built-in preferences to connect with and become part of a clan, a group, a tribe. And your brain and the neurobiology of stress and distress are all woven together with this relational neurobiology. And so really, relational regulation is the most powerful way to buffer stress. And I think that I've said this multiple times, but both our research and the research of many other people converges on this single finding, that if you are with people who you love and respect, you are going to be able to tolerate more adversity, and you're going to be able to heal from previous adversity better. However, if you are in a relationally impoverished situation, you're much more vulnerable to stressors. This is one of the major challenges of the current situation, is that this physical distancing is creating more physical isolation for some families and for some individuals, and it's making it harder for them to take advantage of this powerful relational regulatory capability. And this is why we've talked about intentionally calling, intentionally reaching out to people who are people you may not have talked to for a while, and to try to weave temporarily sort of a digital social fabric, because the real social fabric that we're experiencing right now is being frayed and fragmented.